Hello, hello. My name is Jones, and today we are going to look at crisis counseling. In our first lesson to do with crisis, we defined what crisis is and looked at the signs and symptoms of crisis. We also looked at the types of crisis. Okay, then the lesson that followed, we looked at crisis intervention and we talked about the many interventions that can be done. Okay, so now we are looking at crisis counseling. World Health Organization defines a crisis as any event that a person perceives and describes as a crisis for him or herself. This is simply because the person cannot adapt to the situation and they will fail to function normally. Okay, so crisis intervention involves the short-term use of specific skills and strategies to help the client in the crisis cope with particular emergencies or events. Crisis intervention is active, directive, and brief because it comes acutely and rarely it may come as a chronic situation and it will be solved within some few weeks or months. So crisis intervention mostly is an active, directive, and a brief event. It occurs shortly or immediately after the crisis becomes evident, and the example necessarily that we can give is a client who comes seeking help for pre-test counseling or for the HIV test result during post-test counseling. There are various definitions of crisis, but most emphasize that it can be a turning point in a person's life. Okay, so appreciate the difference that we were talking about crisis in terms of mental health in the other lesson that we were talking about when we introduced the lessons for crisis. Okay, we talked about crisis in mental health, but now we're looking at crisis in counseling. So we can define crisis as a subjective reaction to a stressful life experience. Okay, so here we are just trying to look at it more in the counseling perspective and not in the mental health or psychiatry perspective that we tried to look at in the previous lesson. So it affects the ability of the individual and seriously compromises his or ability to cope and function. That's what necessarily a crisis does. We can go by the definition of the World Health Organization that crisis is any event that a person necessarily perceives and describes as a crisis for him or herself because each and every individual has different reactions to situations that they may be facing. What might seem to be a small problem to others may create a crisis. So a crisis usually involves some type of loss that necessitates a grieving or bereavement period. We normally cannot predict or expect a crisis. It is this unexpectedness which can intensify the reaction to it, that is a crisis, and subsequently affect the coping capacity of the person that is likely or may experience a crisis. When trying to talk about crisis in many definitions and many perspectives, we use words like disequilibrium, disorientation, or disruption as some terms to describe this same reaction of crisis. Reaction to crisis may include apathy, anxiety, guiltiness, depression, or loss of self-esteem. As crisis interveners, we should note, however, that crisis counseling does not address the crisis itself, but rather the person's emotional reactions to it. People in crisis find that what was used to solve problems or cope with difficult situations in the past, these solutions are not necessarily working. So this will threaten them, and they will become more anxious and affect their everyday functioning. Okay, so with that said, let us now look in counseling. Okay, we can look at now the phases of crisis. Okay, so Akan 1992 identified 4 phases of a crisis reaction. So according to Akan, the phases of crisis reaction, and please, the emphasis is crisis reaction here, is we have phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4. So it is important to understand what happens in phase 1. So these are like levels of crisis reaction, okay? What necessarily someone is likely to experience when they are in phase 1, what they are likely to experience, and activities that necessarily may happen when they are in phase 2, what activities and what they are likely to experience when they are in phase 3, and then also what they are likely to experience when they are in phase 4. So in phase 1, from ACA 1992's identified phases of crisis reaction, we can say this is the initial phase, which begins when a person experiences some tension or stress. And after this, the patient may attempt to use habitual kinds of problem-solving skills. So here, when in the initial phase, when they experience some stress situation, the first thing is the same habits of resolving, or the same approach of solving problems. That is, they employ those to restore their emotional equilibrium. So these attempts, they may work sometimes, and the person will continue to function normally. But because this patient is now progressing more in a crisis, we find that these attempts, they will fail. The person then is going to progress to the second phase. Okay, so from phase 1, they will progress to phase 2 simply because habitual kind of approach of problem solving have not worked. So now, what will happen in phase 2? Okay, so this phase is characterized by an increase in tension that leads to anxiety and failure to function normally. We have established that crisis affects psychological, social, and emotional functioning of an individual. So when the client or person facing a crisis sees that their habitual methods have not worked, the tension increases, and this will cause them to panic, or they will have a lot of anxiety. So they want to solve the problem so that they can move forward. So it follows, phase 2 follows the failure of phase 1 attempt to resolve the crisis. So the person may now employ trial and error strategies. Okay, since the habitual kinds of problem solving have not worked, in phase 2 you use trial and error strategies, which may or may not work to resolve the problem. And if the trial and error strategies in phase 2 fail to work, then fail to work in these crisis reaction phases, according to Akan, then they proceed to phase 3. So in phase 3, there is increased tension and threats, requiring additional helping resources such as contact with the counselor, friend, family members, or crisis intervener. Okay, so if one is successful at this stage, this client or person will be able to redefine the problem and redesign oneself on how to resolve such problems. Then if phase 3 fails to resolve after trying to bring in counselors, trying to bring in friends, family members, and the counselors to help. If this fails to resolve and patient cannot redefine their problem, then they will find themselves in phase 4, of crisis reaction. So this phase occurs when the person has not resolved the problem in phase 3, and it presents with a major personality disorganization and emotional breakdown. So in phase 4, the tension that the patient was having from phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 is no longer just the tension. Now they are disorganized because the problem might have taken long to resolve. So they become disorganized and they may have a mental health breakdown because the problem is not being resolved, so they have an emotional breakdown. This phase 4 may require more specialist attention, depending on the problem that the patient is having. This is to help the patient to adapt to the crisis, and this crisis may end up being long-term or something like that. So it may require specialist attention to help patient adapt to their crisis. So it may also require behavioral changes and interpersonal adjustments. An emotional crisis exists when a person feels when a person feels that their crisis has not resolved. So the patient may have an emotional crisis that will affect them. So these are the phases of crisis reaction. So these are the phases of crisis reaction, and the emphasis is crisis reaction. So how necessarily an emotional crisis will come about, that is, if a patient is having an emotional crisis, is when they are intensely threatened or completely surprised or caught unaware of what is necessarily happening. Emotionally disturbed patients may also experience an emotional crisis, or emotionally patients, when they're having an emotional crisis, they may feel emotionally paralyzed, like there is no solution to their problem. So emotional crisis may come up because of this situation. When a patient feels intensely threatened or completely surprised and caught unaware by what is happening, or necessarily when the patient or client is emotionally disturbed as a result of loss of control or emotionally paralyzed because they feel there's no solution to their problem. So if this happens, the emotional crisis, then they will proceed within the crisis reaction of phase 1, 2, 3, and 4. So in light of the crisis, a counselor must necessarily do the following. So as a crisis intervener, you have to remain calm without playing down the crisis. You have to accept the client's definition of their crisis and also begin where the client necessarily is in terms of understanding their situation. You can acknowledge and consider the client's feeling and explore the issues that are involved within this crisis, and you can move over to problem solving and counseling of the patient. And if at all crisis does not resolve, like in stage 4, where they might need specific specialists to help, then you can refer. So with that discussed, then we can now appreciate also some elements of a crisis. What are some of the elements that are there within crisis? It's like when you're saying the psychology of being a patient. So get it? Patients, when they are admitted, they face some challenges. Okay, they face some challenges. Okay, or when you talk about defense mechanisms that the patients may have because they have been admitted. They may have certain behavioral changes. Okay, but in talking about the elements of a crisis here, we are looking at more of the grieving process. Okay, we are looking at more of the reaction process that we see in a patient or clients that may be experiencing a crisis. So the elements of a crisis include blow, recoil, withdrawal, and acceptance. This will also help you to understand also the phases of crisis reaction. So when we say in the elements of crisis, there's a blow, that is a blow. Here, the crisis shocks the person. The shock is the fear of and the realization that something is wrong. So in the grieving process, we talk about the first reaction being shock, the dabda. Okay, the dabda, where we say grieving process by Kubler-Ross, is denial, or there is shock, then there's anger, there is bargaining, there is acceptance, and the likes. So in the elements of a crisis, first there is a blow. There is this huge blow of a crisis which has happened. So the person will be shocked, and this shock is going to induce fear, and then realization in this patient or this client, or that there is something wrong. Okay, so the worst has happened. The worst, that is the blow part, has happened. Then the other elements that will follow or that can be seen is that of recoil. In recoil, the person emotionally struggles to come to terms with the event, and he or she may recall and deny the facts and the present reality. So this is what happens in the recoil. Okay, so from recoil, the other element of a crisis that is seen is that of withdrawal. The clients may go into isolation, and here the nurse may be required to nurse his wounds and sorrow. Okay, so in withdrawal, patient is in so much sorrow and angry with himself or others. Then the other elements, because there are 4 elements, we have acceptance. With the help of counseling, patients may have returned self-esteem that might have been lost, and also that self-worthy, it's going to return, and the patient can now keep on going. Okay, so on elements of a crisis, we have BRWA, that is blow, recoil, withdrawal, and acceptance. Okay, so now let's appreciate the reaction to a crisis. Okay, so when you talk about the reaction to a crisis, okay, here also the similarity of psychology being a patient can apply. In elements, Kubler-Ross model of grieving and the likes, you see some elements of that in some elements of that of Kubler-Ross in the elements of a crisis. Not that it is the same, but there is some similarity on there is some similarities on the stages of grieving of Kubra-Ross, because when you talk about bro, you see the shock issue that is coming. When talking about recoil, here we are seeing that the patient, they may deny the fact, they are more like in a denial. Then withdraw, there is anger, or they are angry with self, and then there is acceptance. But now when talk of reactions to a crisis, this is more like the psychology of being a patient. The psychology being a patient, because life becomes disrupted, so you may end up going into some kind of crisis. So in reaction to a crisis, patients may have denial, may have anger, may have bargaining, may have resignation, may have acceptance. When you say denial here, the patients in a crisis, they will say, this cannot be me, okay, because the blow is too much. So they say, no, this cannot be me. I'm a prayer warrior. I worship God every day. So this cannot be me. So that is the reaction to a crisis, okay, here when you talk of denial. Then anger, then here they may question the supernatural being and say, why me? What have I done to deserve this? So in a reaction to a crisis, you find that people end up to have this stage of anger where they say, why me? What have I done to deserve this? Then the other reaction to a crisis is that of beginning. If only things could get better, I'm going to do ABC. You are going to do wonders. You are going to do miracles. Why? When you find yourself in a crisis and then you start saying, okay, if I just get the finances, I'll have a business. I'll start doing business. I'll start doing ABC. Then you are in the stage of beginning in the reaction to a crisis. Then resignation, here you become helpless. Okay, resignation, here you become helpless. Like lose hope that there's no solution to your problem. So you become helpless. Then acceptance. In acceptance, you necessarily say things like, I'll do my best to make things work. Okay, you have accepted that this worst has happened, the worst blow has happened, but you want to do your best to reduce the impact of the situation. Okay, so now let us appreciate some procedural steps in crisis counseling. Okay, Robert suggested the following crisis counseling steps to help clients. Okay, so the first step is make psychological contact and establish a rapport. Then the second step is examine a dimension of the problem. Then the third step is encourage exploration of feelings and emotions. Then stage 4 is explore and assess past coping attempts. Then the fifth step is generate alternative options. And then the sixth step is develop action plan. Then number 7th step is follow up the client. Okay, so these are the stages, procedural stages that have been put forward by Roberts. Okay, so Robert and Artin. And we have discussed this on crisis intervention, but also in crisis counseling, we also talk about these stages. So when you look at these stages, it's more like problem solving. Okay, problem solving, like if you are doing management, there are stages of problem solving. So here you're just necessarily looking at problem solving. So Roberts and Orton here look at these as procedural steps in crisis counseling. So when you say make psychological contact and establish a rapport, this step involves initial contact between counselor and the client. The counselor here is going to reassure the client that he or she will receive help. So here is making that psychological contact and establishing a rapport. Then the second procedural step in crisis counseling from Robert's suggestion is that of examining the dimension of the problem. Okay, so it is useful to try to identify, that is, the precipitating event that led to the client seeking help, and also the previous coping methods, also looking at the extent to which the client perceives the problem, and then lastly the type of help that the client is seeking. So you can use the techniques of open-ended question in order to make a proper examination of the dimension of the problem. Then the third step in procedural steps in crisis counseling is that of encouraging exploration of feelings and emotion. This step closely relates to step 2, and then in encouraging emotional and feelings of them, feelings and emotions of the client. Here, the counselor should help the client ventilate and express feelings and emotions in an accepting, supportive, private, and non-judgmental setting. Active listening here and empathy will be required from the counselor so that the clients can open up. Then the third procedural step in crisis counseling from Robert Alton's stage, here we can look at encouraging, so that the fourth step is exploring and assessing past coping attempts. An emotional stressful event results in crisis because of habitual problem-solving strategy. These habitual solving strategies that have failed. So the stage, therefore, involves conscious levels. The technique of this choice exploration of information that has been given and also giving a feedback. Okay, the fifth step of procedural procedural step in crisis counseling is generating alternative options. Most clients have an idea in what to do during the coping, but because of disorientation, they fail to take advantage of available strategies to solve their situation. So that is stage 5, generating alternative options. Then the stage 6 of procedural steps in crisis intervention is that of developing an action plan. So for a counselor to help a client develop a workable action plan, they should explore and clarify 3 factors. Firstly, the client should understand the circumstances that led to the crisis and how he or she has experienced it. Then secondly, the client should understand how the crisis has affected his or her expectation, life goals, and the belief system. Okay, so the third part necessarily of this is that he or she should repress or modify irrational beliefs and erroneous cognition. Okay, the seventh procedural step in crisis counseling, according to Robert, is that of follow-up of the clients. So this is necessary step in crisis intervention, as some clients may cancel or stop coming for counseling after second, third, or fourth session. So this can happen prior to resolving the problem. Hence, it is important that we make a follow-up. Okay, so these are the 7 procedural steps in crisis counseling. It is important that as a crisis intervener, you know the major goals of crisis intervention to provide the much support and help that is needed for the clients, and so that you can regain psychological equilibrium, that you can help the patient gain or client gain the psychological equilibrium as quickly as possible. Crisis intervention is reality-oriented and uses existing client relationship networks to provide support and help identify or apply effective coping strategies. So there you have it. We have been looking at crisis in counseling, okay, or we have been looking at crisis counseling. We first defined health that is, we first defined crisis according to the World Health Organization, and then we looked at the many interventions that can be done in crisis. We have also looked at the phases of crisis according to Ockham 1992, who identified the 4 phases of crisis reaction, which included phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4, of which we have emphasized that it is important to know what is happening in phase 1, okay, where we are saying it is the initial phase of crisis reaction, where a person employs habitual methods. Then phase 2, here is when phase 1 patient has not resolved their problem, so there's increased tension. Hence, they start trying other methods. So there's trial and error of other strategies. There's worsening of tension, okay, because of affected normal function, okay, in phase 3. Hence, the person now starts to seek for help from counselor, friends, or crisis interveners. Phase 4, everything has gone to the waste, to a point that the patient or client becomes disorganized and may have an emotional breakdown. When it reaches this stage, we said a specialist attention may be needed. Then we went on to look at how emotional crisis may come, of which we said if someone is intensely threatened or completely surprised by events that have happened. Then in light of the crisis, a counselor, we said, should remain calm, begin from the point where the client understands and accept the client's definition of a crisis, and also acknowledge and consider client's feeling. Then we also looked at elements of a crisis, which include brawl, recoil, withdrawal, and acceptance. Then we looked at reactions to a crisis, which included denial, anger, bargaining, resignation, and the acceptance. Of course, the last part of this lesson that we looked at was procedural steps in crisis counseling, as put forward by Robert. So thank you very much from me, and keep studying.